Chapter 17 Part 1 of News from Nowhere. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. News from Nowhere by William Morris. Chapter 17 Part 1 How the Change Came. Dick broke the silence at last, saying, "Guest, forgive us for a little after-dinner dullness. What would you like to do? Shall we have out Greylocks and trot back to Hammersmith? Or will you come with us and hear some Welsh folk sing in a hall close by here? Or would you like presently to come with me into the city and see some really fine building? Or what shall it be?" "Well," said I, "as I am a stranger, I must let you choose for me." In point of fact, I did not by any means want to be amused just then, and also I felt rather as if the old man, with his knowledge of past times, and even a kind of inverted sympathy for them caused by his active hatred of them, was as it were a blanket for me against the cold of this very new world, where I was, so to say, stripped bare of every habitual thought and way of acting, and I did not want to leave him too soon. He came to my rescue at once, and said, "Wait a bit, Dick. There is someone else to be consulted besides you and the guest here, and that is I. I am not going to lose the pleasure of his company just now, especially as I know he has something else to ask me. So go to your Welshman by all means, but first of all bring us another bottle of wine to this nook, and then be off as soon as you like, and come again and fetch our friend to go westward, but not too soon." Dick nodded smilingly, and the old man and I were soon alone in the great hall, the afternoon sun gleaming on the red wine in our tall quaint-shaped glasses. Then said Hammond: "Does anything especially puzzle you about our way of living, now you have heard a good deal and seen a little of it?" Said I think what puzzles me most is how it all came about." "It well may," said he, "so great as the change is. It would be difficult indeed to tell you the whole story, perhaps impossible. Knowledge, discontent, treachery, disappointment, ruin, misery, despair: those who worked for the change because they could see further than other people went through all these phases of suffering, and doubtless all the time the most of men looked on, not knowing what was doing, thinking it all a matter of course, like the rising and the setting of the sun. And indeed it was so." "Tell me one thing, if you can," said I. "Did the change, the revolution it used to be called, come peacefully?" "Peacefully?" said he. "What peace was there among those poor confused wretches of the 19th century? It was war from beginning to end, bitter war, till hope and pleasure put an end to it." "Do you mean actual fighting with weapons?" said I, "or the strikes and lockouts and starvation of which we have heard?" "Both, both," he said. "As a matter of fact, the history of the terrible period of transition from commercial slavery to freedom may be thus summarised. When the hope of realising a communal condition of life for all men arose, quite late in the 19th century, the power of the middle classes, the then tyrants of society, was so enormous and crushing, that to almost all men, even those who had, you may say, despite themselves, despite their reason and judgment, conceived such hopes, it seemed a dream. So much was this the case that some of those more enlightened men who were then called Socialists, although they well knew, and even stated in public, that the only reasonable condition of society was that of pure communism, such as you now see around you, yet shrunk from what seemed to them the barren task of preaching the realisation of a happy dream. Looking back now, we can see that the great motive power of the change was a longing for freedom and equality, akin, if you please, to the unreasonable passion of the lover, a sickness of heart that rejected with loathing the aimless solitary life of the well-to-do educated man of that time. Phrases, my dear friend, which have lost their meaning to us of the present day, so far removed we are from the dreadful facts which they represent. Well, these men, though conscious of this feeling, had no faith in it, as a means of bringing about the change.
Nor was that wonderful, for looking around them they saw the huge mass of the oppressed classes too much burdened with the misery of their lives, and too much overwhelmed by the selfishness of misery, to be able to form a conception of any escape from it, except by the ordinary way prescribed by the system of slavery under which they lived, which was nothing more than a remote chance of climbing out of the oppressed and into the oppressing class. Therefore, though they knew that the only reasonable aim for those who would better the world was a condition of equality, in their impatience and despair they managed to convince themselves that if they could by hook or by crook get the machinery of production and the management of property so altered that the lower classes, so the horrible word ran, might have their slavery somewhat ameliorated, they would be ready to fit into this machinery, and use it for bettering their condition still more and still more, until at last the result would be a practical equality. They were very fond of using the word practical, because the rich would be forced to pay out so much for keeping the poor in a tolerable condition, that the condition of riches would become no longer valuable, and would gradually die out. Do you follow me?"
"Partly," said I. "Go on."
Said old Hammond, "Well, since you follow me, you will see that as a theory this was not altogether unreasonable, but practically it turned out a failure."
"How so?" said I.
"Well, don't you see?" he said, "because it involved the making of a machinery by those who didn't know what they wanted the machines to do. So far as the masses of the oppressed class furthered this scheme of improvement, they did it to get themselves improved slave rations, as many of them as could; and if those classes had really been incapable of being touched by that instinct which produced the passion for freedom and equality aforesaid, what would have happened, I think, would have been this: that a certain part of the working classes would have been so far improved in condition that they would have approached the condition of the middling rich men, but below them would have been a great class of most miserable slaves, whose slavery would have been far more hopeless than the older class slavery had been."
"What stood in the way of this?" said I.
"Why, of course," said he, "just that instinct for freedom aforesaid. It is true that the slave class could not conceive the happiness of a free life; yet they grew to understand, and very speedily too, that they were oppressed by their masters, and they assumed, you see how justly, that they could do without them, though perhaps they scarce knew how; so that it came to this, that though they could not look forward to the happiness of peace or of the freeman, they did at least look forward to the war which a vague hope told them would bring that peace about."
"Could you tell me rather more closely what actually took place?" said I, for I thought him rather vague here.
"Yes," he said, "I can. That machinery of life for the use of people who didn't know what they wanted of it, and which was known at that time as State Socialism, was partly put in motion, though in a very piecemeal way. But it did not work smoothly. It was, of course, resisted at every turn by the capitalists, and no wonder, for it tended more and more to upset the commercial system I have told you of, without providing anything really effective in its place. The result was growing confusion, great suffering amongst the working classes, and as a consequence great discontent. For a long time matters went on like this. The power of the upper classes had lessened, as their command over wealth lessened, and they could not carry things wholly by the high hand as they had been used to in earlier days. So far the State Socialists were justified by the result. On the other hand, the working classes were ill organised, and growing poorer in reality, in spite of the gains, also real in the long run, which they had forced from the masters. Thus matters hung in the balance. The masters could not reduce their slaves to complete subjection, though they put down some feeble and partial riots easily enough. The workers forced their masters to grant them ameliorations, real or imaginary, of their condition, but could not force freedom from them. At last came a great crash. To explain this you must understand that very great progress had been made amongst the workers, though, as before said, but little in the direction of improved livelihood."
I played the innocent and said, "In what direction could they improve, if not in livelihood?" Said he,
in the power to bring about a state of things in which livelihood would be full and easy to gain. They had at last learned how to combine after a long period of mistakes and disasters. The workmen had now a regular organisation in the struggle against their masters, a struggle which for more than half a century had been accepted as an inevitable part of the conditions of the modern system of labour and production. This combination had now taken the form of a federation of all or almost all the recognised wage-paid employments, and it was by its means that those betterments of the conditions of the workmen had been forced from the masters, and though they were not seldom mixed up with the rioting that happened, especially in the earlier days of their organisation, it by no means formed an essential part of their tactics. Indeed, at the time I am now speaking of, they had got to be so strong that most commonly the mere threat of a strike was enough to gain any minor point. Because they had given up the foolish tactics of the ancient trades unions, of calling out of work a part only of the workers of such and such an industry, and supporting them while out of work on the labour of those that remained in. By this time they had a biggish fund of money for the support of strikes, and could stop a certain industry altogether for a time, if they so determined.
Said I, was there not a serious danger of such moneys being misused, of jobbery in fact? Old Hammond wriggled uneasily on his seat, and said,
"Though all this happened so long ago, I still feel the pain of mere shame when I have to tell you that it was more than a danger, that such rascality often happened; indeed more than once the whole combination seemed dropping to pieces because of it. But at the time of which I am telling, things looked so threatening, and to the workmen at least the necessity of their dealing with the fast gathering trouble which the labour struggle had brought about was so clear, that the conditions of the times had begot a deep seriousness amongst all reasonable people, a determination which put aside all non-essentials, and which to thinking men was ominous of the swiftly approaching change. Such an element was too dangerous for mere traitors and self-seekers, and one by one they were thrust out and mostly joined the declared reactionaries."
"How about those ameliorations?" said I. "What were they? Or rather, of what nature?"
Said he, "Some of them, and these of the most practical importance to the men's livelihood, were yielded by the masters by direct compulsion on the part of the men. The new conditions of labour so gained were indeed only customary, enforced by no law; but once established, the masters durst not attempt to withdraw them in face of the growing power of the combined workers. Some again were steps on the path of State Socialism, the most important of which can be speedily summed up. At the end of the 19th century the cry arose for compelling the masters to employ their men a less number of hours in the day. This cry gathered volume quickly, and the masters had to yield to it. But it was of course clear that unless this meant a higher price for work per hour, it would be a mere nullity, and that the masters, unless forced, would reduce it to that. Therefore, after a long struggle, another law was passed, fixing a minimum price for labour in the most important industries, which again had to be supplemented by a law fixing the maximum price on the chief wares then considered necessary for a workman's life."
"You were getting perilously near to the late Roman poor rates," said I, smiling, "and the doling out of bread to the proletariat."
"So many said at the time," said the old man dryly, "and it has long been a commonplace that that slough awaits State Socialism in the end, if it gets to the end, which as you know it did not with us. However, it went further than this minimum and maximum business, which by the by we can see now was necessary. The government now found it imperative on them to meet the outcry of the master class at the approaching destruction of commerce, as desirable, had they known it, as the extinction of the cholera, which has since happily taken place. And they were forced to meet it by a measure hostile to the masters, the establishment of government factories for the production of necessary wares, and markets for their sale. These measures, taken altogether, did do something. They were, in fact, of the nature of regulations made by the commander of a beleaguered city. But of course to the privileged classes it seemed as if the end of the world were come when such laws were enacted. Nor was that altogether without a warrant. The spread of communistic theories and the partial practice of State Socialism had at first disturbed and at last almost paralysed the marvellous system of commerce, under which the old world had lived so feverishly, and had produced for some few a life of gambler's pleasure, and for many, or most, a life of mere misery. Over and over again came bad times, as they were called, and indeed they were bad enough for the wage slaves. The year 1952 was one of the worst of these times. The workmen suffered dreadfully. The partial, inefficient government factories, which were terribly jobbed, all but broke down, and a vast part of the population had for the time being to be fed on undisguised charity, as it was called. The combined workers watched the situation with mingled hope and anxiety. They had already formulated their general demands, but now, by a solemn and universal vote of the whole of their federated societies, they insisted on the first step being taken toward carrying out their demands. This step would have led directly to handing over the management of the whole natural resources of the country, together with the machinery for using them, into the power of the combined workers, and the reduction of the privileged classes into the position of pensioners, obviously dependent on the pleasure of the workers. The resolution, as it was called, which was widely published in the newspapers of the day, was in fact a declaration of war, and was so accepted by the master class. They began henceforward to prepare for a firm stand against the brutal and ferocious communism of the day, as they phrased it. And as they were in many ways still very powerful, or seemed so to be, they still hoped by means of brute force to regain some of what they had lost, and perhaps in the end the whole of it. It was said amongst them on all hands that it had been a great mistake of the various governments not to have resisted sooner, and the Liberals and Radicals, the name, as perhaps you may know, of the more democratically inclined part of the ruling classes, were much blamed for having led the world to this pass by their mistimed pedantry and foolish sentimentality; and one Gladstone, or Gledstein, probably, judging by this name, of Scandinavian descent, a notable politician of the 19th century, was especially singled out for reprobation in this respect. I need scarcely point out to you the absurdity of all this. But terrible tragedy lay hidden behind this grinning through a horse-collar of the reactionary party. The insatiable greed of the lower classes must be repressed. The people must be taught a lesson. These were the sacramental phrases current amongst the reactionists, and ominous enough they were.
The old man stopped to look keenly at my attentive and wondering face, and then said,
"I know, dear guest, that I have been using words and phrases which few people amongst us could understand without long and laborious explanation, and not even then, perhaps. But since you have not yet gone to sleep, and since I am speaking to you as to a being from another planet, I may venture to ask you if you have followed me thus far?"
"Oh yes," said I quite understand. Pray go on. A great deal of what you have been saying was commonplace with us when
"Yes," he said gravely, "when you were dwelling in the other planet. Well, now for the crash aforesaid. On some comparatively trifling occasion, a great meeting was summoned by the workmen leaders to meet in Trafalgar Square, about the right to meet in which place there had for years and years been bickering. The civic bourgeois guard, called the police, attacked the said meeting with bludgeons, according to their custom. Many people were hurt in the mêlée, of whom 5 in all died, either trampled to death on the spot, or from the effects of their cudgelling. The meeting was scattered, and some 100 of prisoners cast into gaol. A similar meeting had been treated in the same way a few days before at a place called Manchester, which has now disappeared. Thus the lesson began. The whole country was thrown into a ferment by this. Meetings were held which attempted some rough organisation for the holding of another meeting to retort on the authorities. A huge crowd assembled in Trafalgar Square, and the neighbourhood, then a place of crowded streets, was too big for the bludgeon-armed police to cope with. There was a good deal of dry-blow fighting, 3 or 4 of the people were killed, and half a score of policemen were crushed to death in the throng, and the rest got away as they could. This was a victory for the people as far as it went. The next day all London, remember what it was in those days, was in a state of turmoil. Many of the rich fled into the country, the executives got together soldiery, but did not dare to use them, and the police could not be massed in any one place because riots or threats of riots were everywhere. But in Manchester, where the people were not so courageous or not so desperate as in London, several of the popular leaders were arrested. In London a convention of leaders was got together from the Federation of Combined Workmen, and sat under the old revolutionary name of the Committee of Public Safety; but as they had no drilled and armed body of men to direct, they attempted no aggressive measures, but only placarded the walls with somewhat vague appeals to the workmen not to allow themselves to be trampled upon. However, they called a meeting in Trafalgar Square for the day fortnight of the last mentioned skirmish. Meanwhile the town grew no quieter, and business came pretty much to an end. The newspapers, then, as always hitherto, almost entirely in the hands of the masters, clamoured to the government for repressive measures. The rich citizens were enrolled as an extra body of police, and armed with bludgeons like them. Many of these were strong, well-fed, full-blooded young men, and had plenty of stomach for fighting, but the government did not dare to use them, and contented itself with getting full powers voted to it by the Parliament for suppressing any revolt, and bringing up more and more soldiers to London. Thus passed the week after the great meeting. Almost as large a one was held on the Sunday, which went off peaceably on the whole, as no opposition to it was offered, and again the people cried victory. But on the Monday the people woke up to find that they were hungry. During the last few days there had been groups of men parading the streets, asking, or if you please demanding, money to buy food, and what for goodwill, what for fear, the richer people gave them a good deal. The authorities of the parishes also, I haven't time to explain that phrase at present, gave willy-nilly what provisions they could to wandering people, and the government, by means of its feeble national workshops, also fed a good number of half-starved folk. But, in addition to this, several bakers' shops and other provision stores had been emptied without a great deal of disturbance. So far so good. But on the Monday in question the Committee of Public Safety, on the one hand afraid of general unorganised pillage, and on the other emboldened by the wavering conduct of the authorities, sent a deputation provided with carts and all necessary gear to clear out 2 or 3 big provision stores in the centre of the town, leaving papers with the shop managers promising to pay the price of them; and also in the part of the town where they were strongest they took possession of several bakers' shops, and set men at work in them for the benefit of the people; all of which was done with little or no disturbance, the police assisting in keeping order at the sack of the stores, as they would have done at a big fire. But at this last stroke the reactionaries were so alarmed that they were determined to force the executive into action. The newspapers next day all blazed into the fury of frightened people, and threatened the people, the government, and everybody they could think of, unless order was at once restored. A deputation of leading commercial people waited on the government, and told them that if they did not at once arrest the Committee of Public Safety, they themselves would gather together a body of men, arm them, and fall on the incendiaries, as they called them. They, together with a number of the newspaper editors, had a long interview with the heads of the government and 2 or 3 military men, the deftest in their art that the country could furnish. The deputation came away from that interview, says a contemporary eye-witness, smiling and satisfied, and said no more about raising an anti-popular army, but that afternoon left London with their families for their country seats or elsewhere. The next morning the government proclaimed a state of siege in London, a thing common enough amongst the absolutist governments on the Continent, but unheard of in England in those days. They appointed the youngest and cleverest of their generals to command the proclaimed district, a man who had won a certain sort of reputation in the disgraceful wars in which the country had been long engaged from time to time. The newspapers were in ecstasies, and all the most fervent of the reactionaries now came to the front; men who in ordinary times were forced to keep their opinions to themselves, or their immediate circle, but who began to look forward to crushing once for all the socialist, and even democratic tendencies, which, said they, had been treated with such foolish indulgence for the last 60 years. But the clever general took no visible action, and yet only a few of the minor newspapers abused him. Thoughtful men gathered from this that a plot was hatching. As for the Committee of Public Safety, whatever they thought of that position, they had now gone too far to draw back, and many of them, it seems, thought that the government would not act. They went on quietly organising their food supply, which was a miserable driblet when all is said, and also as a retort to the state of siege they armed as many men as they could in the quarter where they were strongest, but did not attempt to drill or organise them, thinking perhaps that they could not at the best turn them into trained soldiers till they had some breathing space. The clever general, his soldiers, and the police did not meddle with all this in the least in the world, and things were quieter in London that week end, though there were riots in many places of the provinces, which were quelled by the authorities without much trouble. The most serious of these were at Glasgow and Bristol. Well, the Sunday of the meeting came, and great crowds came to Trafalgar Square in procession, the greater part of the committee amongst them, surrounded by their band of men armed somehow or other. The streets were quite peaceful and quiet, though there were many spectators to see the procession pass. Trafalgar Square had no body of police in it. The people took quiet possession of it, and the meeting began. The armed men stood round the principal platform, and there were a few others armed amidst the general crowd, but by far the greater part were unarmed. Most people thought the meeting would go off peaceably, but the members of the committee had heard from various quarters that something would be attempted against them, but these rumours were vague, and they had no idea of what threatened. They soon found out. For before the streets about the square were filled, a body of soldiers poured into it from the north-west corner and took up their places by the houses that stood on the west side. The people growled at the sight of the redcoats. The armed men of the committee stood undecided, not knowing what to do. And indeed this new influx so jammed the crowd together that, unorganised as they were, they had little chance of working through it. They had scarcely grasped the fact of their enemies being there, when another column of soldiers, pouring out of the streets which led into the great southern road going down to the Parliament House, still existing and called the Dung Market, and also from the embankment by the side of the Thames, marched up, pushing the crowd into a denser and denser mass, and formed along the south side of the square. Then any of those who could see what was going on knew at once that they were in a trap, and could only wonder what would be done with them. The closely packed crowd would not or could not budge, except under the influence of the height of terror, which was soon to be supplied to them. A few of the armed men struggled to the front, or climbed up the base of the monument which then stood there, that they might face the wall of hidden fire before them, and to most men, there were many women amongst them, it seemed as if the end of the world had come, and to-day seemed strangely different from yesterday. No sooner were the soldiers drawn up aforesaid, than, says an eye-witness, a glittering officer on horseback came prancing out from the ranks on the south, and read something from a paper which he held in his hand, which something very few heard, but I was told afterwards that it was an order for us to disperse, and a warning that he had legal right to fire on the crowd else, and that he would do so. The crowd took it as a challenge of some sort, and a hoarse threatening roar went up from them, and after that there was comparative silence for a little, till the officer had got back into the ranks, which I knew for mechanical guns. I cried out, "Throw yourselves down, they are going to fire!" But no one scarcely could throw himself down, so tight as the crowd were packed. I heard a sharp order given, and wondered where I should be the next minute, and then it was as if the earth had opened, and hell had come up bodily amidst us. It is no use trying to describe the scene that followed. Deep lanes were mowed amidst the thick crowd, the dead and dying covered the ground, and the shrieks and wails and cries of horror filled all the air, till it seemed as if there were nothing else in the world but murder and death. Those of our armed men who were still unhurt cheered wildly and opened a scattering fire on the soldiers. 1 or 2 soldiers fell, and I saw the officers going up and down the ranks urging the men to fire again, but they received the orders in sullen silence, and let the butts of their guns fall. Only one sergeant ran to a machine-gun and began to set it going, but a tall young man, an officer too, ran out of the ranks and dragged him back by the collar, and the soldiers stood there motionless while the horror-stricken crowd, nearly wholly unarmed, for most of the armed men had fallen in that first discharge, drifted out of the square. I was told afterwards that the soldiers on the west side had fired also, and done their part of the slaughter. How I got out of the square I scarcely know. I went, not feeling the ground under me, what with rage and terror and despair. So says our eye-witness. The number of the slain on the side of the people in that shooting during a minute was prodigious, but it was not easy to come at the truth about it. It was probably between 1,000 and 2,000. Of the soldiers, 6 were killed outright, and a dozen wounded.
I listened, trembling with excitement. The old man's eyes glittered and his face flushed as he spoke, and told the tale of what I had often thought might happen. Yet I wondered that he should have got so elated about a mere massacre, and I said, "How fearful! And I suppose that this massacre put an end to the whole revolution for that time?"
"No, no," cried old Hammond. "It began it."
End of chapter 17, part 1.